Station 11, Section 3. I Prefer You with a Crown. Chapter 13. A photo from the tabloid. 10 minutes before the photograph, Arthur Leander and the girl are waiting by the coat check in a restaurant in Toronto. This is well before the Georgia flu. Civilization won't collapse for another 14 years. Arthur has been filming a period drama all week, partly on a soundstage and partly in a park on the edge of the city. Earlier in the day, he was wearing a crown, but now he's wearing a Toronto Blue Jays cap that makes him look very ordinary. He is 36 years old. "What are you going to do?" he asks. "I'm going to leave him." The girl, Miranda, has a recent bruise on her face. They're speaking in whispers to avoid being overheard by the restaurant staff. He nods. Good. He's looking at the bruise, which Miranda hasn't been entirely successful in concealing with makeup. "I was hoping you'd say that. What do you need?" "I don't know," she says. "I'm sorry about all this. I just can't go home." "I have a suggestion." He stops because the coat check girl has returned with their coats. Arthur's is magnificent, smooth and expensive looking. Miranda's a battered pea coat that she found in a thrift store for $10. She turns her back on the restaurant as she puts it on in an effort to hide the torn lining. When she turns back, something in the hostess's smile suggests that this effort was in vain. While Arthur, who by this point in his life is extravagantly famous, flashes his best smile and palms a 20 to the coat check girl. The hostess is surreptitiously hitting send on a text to a photographer who gave her $50 earlier. Outside on the sidewalk, the photographer reads the message on his phone. "Leaving now." "As I was saying," Arthur murmurs, close to Miranda's ear, "I think you should come stay with me." "At the hotel? I can't," Miranda whispers. "I insist. No strings attached." Miranda is momentarily distracted by the coat check girl, who is staring adoringly at Arthur. He whispers, "You don't have to make any decisions right away. It's just a place you can stay, if you'd like." Miranda's eyes fill with tears. "I don't know what to..." "Just say yes, Miranda." "Yes, thank you." It occurs to her as the hostess opens the door for them that she must look terrible, the bruise on her face and her eyes red and watery. "Wait," she says, fishing in her handbag. "I'm sorry, just a second." She puts on the enormous sunglasses she'd been wearing earlier in the day. Arthur puts his arm around her shoulders. The photographer on the sidewalk raises his camera, and they step out into the blinding flash. "So, Arthur," the journalist is beautiful in the manner of people who spend an immense amount of money on personal maintenance. She has professionally refined pores and a $400 haircut, impeccable makeup, and tastefully polished nails. When she smiles, Arthur is distracted by the unnatural whiteness of her teeth, although he's been in Hollywood for years and should be used to it by now. "Tell us about this mystery brunette we've been seeing you with." "I think that mystery brunette has a right to her privacy, don't you?" Arthur's smile is calibrated to diffuse the remark and render it charming. "Won't you tell us anything at all about her? Just a hint?" "She's from my hometown," he says, and winks. "It's not a hometown, actually. It's a home island. It's the same size and shape as Manhattan," Arthur tells people at parties all his life, "except with 1,000 people. Delano Island is between Vancouver Island and mainland British Columbia, a straight shot north from Los Angeles. The island is all temperate rainforest and rocky beaches, deer breaking into vegetable gardens and leaping in front of windshields, moss on low-hanging branches, a sighing of wind and cedar trees. In the middle of the island there's a small lake that Arthur always imagined was formed by an asteroid, almost perfectly round and very deep. One summer a young woman from somewhere else committed suicide there, left her car parked up on the road with a note, and walked into the water. And then when divers went after her, they couldn't find the bottom of the lake. Or so local children whispered to one another, half frightened, half thrilled, although upon reflection years later, the idea of a lake so deep that divers can't reach the bottom seems improbable. Still, the fact is that a woman walked into a lake that wasn't large, and no one found the body for 2 weeks despite intensive searching, when the episode sparks up against Arthur's childhood memories retrospectively and leaves a frisson of darkness that wasn't there at the time. Because actually, from day to day, it's just a lake, just his favorite place to swim. Everyone's favorite place to swim, because the ocean is always freezing. In Arthur's memories of the lake, his mother is reading a book under the trees on the shore while his little brother splashes around with water wings in the shallows, and bugs land fleetingly on the water's surface. For unknown reasons, there is a naked Barbie doll buried up to her waist in the dirt on the lake road. There are children on the island who go barefoot all summer and wear feathers in their hair. The Volkswagen vans in which their parents arrived in the 70s turning to rust in the forest. Every year there are approximately 200 days of rain. There's a village of sorts by the ferry terminal, a general store with one gas pump, a health food store, a real estate office, an elementary school with 60 students, a community hall with two massive carved mermaids holding hands to form an archway over the front door and a tiny library attached. The rest of the island is mostly rock and forest, narrow roads with dirt driveways disappearing into the trees. In other words, it's the kind of place that practically no one Arthur encounters in New York, Toronto, or Los Angeles can fathom, and he gets a lot of uncomprehending stares when he talks about it. He is forever trying to describe this place and resorting to generalizations about beaches and plant life. The ferns were up to my head, he tells people, performing a gesture that suggests greater and greater height over the years until he realizes at some point in his mid-40s that he's describing plants that stand 7 or 8 feet tall. Just unbelievable in retrospect. It must have been so beautiful, is the inevitable reply. It was, he tells them. It is. And then finds a way to change the subject because it's difficult to explain this next part. Yes, it was beautiful. It was the most beautiful place I have ever seen. It was gorgeous and claustrophobic. I loved it, and I always wanted to escape. At 17, he's accepted into the University of Toronto. He fills out the student loan applications, his parents scrape up the money for the plane ticket, and he's gone. He thought he wanted to study economics, but when he arrives in Toronto, he discovers that he wants to do almost anything else. He worked hard in high school, but he is an indifferent student at the university. The classes are tedious. The point of coming to the city wasn't school, he decides. School was just his method of escape. The point was the city of Toronto itself. Within 4 months, he's dropped out and is going to acting auditions because some girl in his Commerce 101 class told him he should be an actor. His parents are horrified. There are tearful phone calls on calling cards late at night. The point was to get off the island, he tells them, but this doesn't help because they love the island and they live there on purpose. But 2 months after leaving school, he gets a bit part in an American movie filming locally, and then a one-line role in a Canadian TV show. He doesn't feel that he really has any idea how to act, so he starts spending all his money on acting classes, where he meets his best friend, Clark. There's a magnificent year when they are inseparable and go out 4 nights a week with fake IDs. And then when both of them are 19, Clark succumbs to parental pressure and returns to England for university, while Arthur auditions successfully for a theater school in New York City, where he works for cash in a restaurant and lives with 4 roommates above a bakery in Queens. He graduates from the theater school and marks time for a while, auditioning and working long hours as a waiter, then a job on Law & Order. Is there an actor in New York who hasn't worked on Law & Order? That lands him an agent and turns into a reoccurring role on a different Law & Order, one of the spin-offs. A couple of commercials, 2 television pilots that don't get picked up, but you should totally come out to LA, the director of the second one says when he calls Arthur with the bad news. Crash in my guest house for a few weeks, do some auditions, see what happens. And Arthur's sick of Eastern winters by then, so he does it. He gets rid of most of his belongings and boards a westbound plane. In Hollywood, he goes to parties and lands a small part in a movie, a soldier with 3 lines who gets blown up in the first 10 minutes. But this leads to a much bigger movie part, and this is when the parties begin in earnest. Cocaine and smooth girls with perfect skin in houses and hotel rooms. A number of years that come back to him later in strobe-like flashes. Sitting by a pool in Malibu drinking vodka and talking to a girl who says she came here illegally from Mexico, crossed the border, lying under a load of chili peppers in the back of a truck when she was 10. He's not sure whether to believe her, but he thinks she's beautiful, so he kisses her and she says she'll call, but he never sees her again. Driving in the hills with friends, a passenger in a convertible with the top down, his friends singing along with the radio while Arthur watches the palm trees slipping past overhead, dancing with the girl to Don't Stop Believin', secretly his favorite song, in some guy's basement tiki bar, and then it seems like a miracle when he sees her at someone else's party a week later, the same girl at two parties in this infinite city. She smiles at him with half-closed eyes and takes his hand, leads him out to the backyard to watch the sun rise over Los Angeles. The novelty of this town is starting to wear a little thin by then, but up there by Mulholland Drive, he understands that there's still some mystery here, still something in this city he hasn't seen. A sea of lights fading out in the valley as the sun rises, the way she runs her fingernails lightly over the skin of his arm. I love this place, he says, but 6 months later, when they're breaking up, she throws the line back at him. You love this place, but you'll never belong here, and you'll never be cast as a lead in any of your stupid movies. And by this point, he's 28, time speeding up in a way that disconcerts him. The party's going too late and getting too sloppy, waiting in the ER on 2 separate occasions for news of friends who've OD'd on exotic combinations of alcohol and prescription medications. The same people at party after party. The sun rising on scenes of tedious debauchery, everyone looking a little undone. Just after his 29th birthday, he lands the lead in a low-budget film about a botched bank robbery, and is pleased to learn that it's filming in Toronto. He likes the idea of returning to Canada in triumph, which he's aware is egotistical, but what can you do? Arthur's mother calls one night and asks if he remembers Susie, that woman who was a waitress at the general store cafe when he was a kid. Of course he remembers Susie. He has vivid memories of Susie serving him pancakes in the cafe. Anyway, Susie's niece came to live with her a few years back for reasons that remain buried despite the dedicated excavation efforts of every gossip on the island. The niece, Miranda, is 17 now, and just very driven, very together. She recently moved to Toronto to go to art school, and could Arthur maybe take her to lunch? Why? He asks. We don't know each other. She's a 17-year-old girl. It'll be kind of awkward, won't it? He hates awkwardness and goes to great lengths to avoid it. You have a lot in common, his mother says. You both skipped a grade in school. I'm not sure that qualifies as a lot. But even as he says this, he finds himself thinking, she'll know where I'm from. Arthur lives in a permanent state of disorientation, like a low-grade fever, the question hanging over everything being, how did I get from there to here? And there are moments, at parties in Toronto, in Los Angeles, in New York, when he'll be telling people about Delano Island and he'll notice a certain look on their faces. Interested, but a little incredulous, like he's describing an upbringing on the surface of Mars. For obvious reasons, very few people have heard of Delano Island. When he tells people in Toronto that he's from British Columbia, they'll invariably say something about how they like Vancouver, as though that glass city 4 hours and 2 ferries to the southeast of his childhood home has anything to do with the island where he grew up. On 2 separate occasions, he's told people in Los Angeles that he's from Canada, and they've asked about igloos. An allegedly well-educated New Yorker once listened carefully to his explanation of where he's from, southwestern British Columbia, an island between Vancouver Island and the mainland, and then asked, apparently in all seriousness, if this means he grew up near Maine. Call Miranda, his mother says. It's just lunch. Miranda at 17. She is preternaturally composed and very pretty, pale with gray eyes and dark curls. She comes into the restaurant in a rush of cold air, January clinging to her hair and her coat, and Arthur is struck immediately by her poise. She seems much older than her age. How do you like Toronto? Arthur asks. Not merely pretty, he decides. She's actually beautiful, but it's a subtle kind of beauty that takes some time to make itself apparent. She's the opposite of the LA girls with their blonde hair and tight t-shirts and tans. I love it. The revelation of privacy. She can walk down the street, and absolutely no one knows who she is. It's possible that no one who didn't grow up in a small place can understand how beautiful this is, how the anonymity of city life feels like freedom. She starts telling him about her boyfriend Pablo. also an artist, and Arthur forces himself to smile as he listens. She's so young, he tells himself. She's tired of talking about herself and asks about him, and he tries to explain the surrealism of this world he stepped into, where people know him when he doesn't know them. He talks about how much he loves Los Angeles, and how simultaneously the place exhausts him, how disoriented he feels when he thinks about Delano Island, and compares it to his current life. She's never been to the United States, although she's lived within 200 miles of the border all her life. He can see that she's straining to imagine his life there, her thoughts probably a collage of scenes from movies and magazine shoots. You love acting, don't you? Yes, usually I do. What a wonderful thing, to get paid for doing what you love, she says, and he agrees with this. At the end of the meal, she thanks him for paying the check, and they leave together. Outside, the air is cold, sunlight on dirty snow. Later, he'll remember this as a golden period, when they could walk out of restaurants together without anyone taking pictures of them on the sidewalk. Good luck on the movie, she says, boarding a streetcar. Good luck in Toronto, he replies, but she's already gone. In the years that follow, he's often successful at putting her out of his mind. She is far away and very young. There are a number of movies, an 18-month relocation to New York for a Mammoth play, back to Los Angeles for a recurring role in an HBO series. He dates other women, some actresses, some not, two of them so famous that they can't go out in public without attracting photographers who swarm like mosquitoes. By the time he returns to Toronto for another movie, he can't go out in public without being photographed either, partly because the movie parts have gotten much bigger and more impressive, partly because the photographers got used to taking his picture when he was holding hands with more famous people. His agent congratulates him on his dating strategy. It wasn't being strategic, Arthur says. I dated them because I liked them. Sure you did, his agent said. I'm just saying, it didn't hurt. Did he actually date those women because he liked them? Or was his career in the back of his mind the whole time? The question is unexpectedly haunting. Arthur is 36 now, which makes Miranda 24. He is becoming extremely unpleasantly famous. He wasn't expecting fame, although he secretly longed for it in his 20s, just like everyone else. And now that he has it, he's not sure what to do with it. It's mostly embarrassing. He checks into the Hotel Le Garmain in Toronto, for example, and the young woman at the registration desk tells him what an honor it is to have him staying with them. And if you don't mind me saying so, I adored that detective film. And as always in these situations, he isn't sure what to say. He honestly can't tell if she really did enjoy the detective film, or if she's just being nice, or if she wants to sleep with him, or some combination of the above. So he smiles and thanks her, flustered and not sure where to look, takes the key card and feels her gaze on his back as he walks to the elevators. Trying to look purposeful, also trying to convey the impression that he hasn't noticed and doesn't care that half the population of the lobby is staring at him. Once in the room, he sits on the bed, relieved to be alone and unlooked at, but feeling as he always does in these moments, a little disoriented, obscurely deflated, a bit at a loss, and then all at once he knows what to do. He calls the cell phone number he's been saving all these years. Miranda is at work when Arthur Leanda calls her again. She's an administrative assistant at a shipping company, Neptune Logistics, where she spends quiet days at a desk shaped like a horseshoe in a private reception area outside her boss's office door. Her boss is a young executive named Leon Prevant, and his door is almost always closed because he's almost always out of town. There are acres of gray carpeting and a wall of glass with a view of Lake Ontario near her desk. There's rarely enough work to keep her occupied for more than an hour or two at a time, which means she can often spend entire afternoons sketching. She's working on a series of graphic novels, with long coffee breaks, during which she likes to stand by the glass wall and look out at the lake. When she stands here, she feels suspended, floating over the city. The stillness of the water, the horizon framed by other glass towers and miniature boats drifting in the distance. A soft chime signifies an incoming email. During the long period when her position was staffed by an incompetent temp, the winter of our discontent, Leon Brevant calls it, Leon took to outsourcing his travel planning to his subordinate, Hannah's administrative assistant Thea, who is impeccable in a smooth corporate way that Miranda admires, and who has just forwarded Leon's flight confirmation emails for next month's trip to Tokyo. In Thea's presence, she feels ragged and unkempt, curls sticking up in all directions, while Thea's hair is glossy and precise. Her clothes never quite right, whereas Thea's clothes are perfect. Miranda's lipstick is always too gaudy or too dark, her heels too high or too low. Her stockings all have holes in the feet and have to be worn strategically with specific pairs of shoes. The shoes have scuffed heels, filled in carefully with permanent marker. The clothes are a problem. Most of Miranda's office clothes come from a bargain outlet just off of Yonge Street, and they always look okay under the dressing room lights, but by the time she gets home, they're all wrong. The black skirt shining with acrylic fibers, the blouse in a synthetic fabric that clings unpleasantly, everything cheap-looking and highly flammable. "You're an artist," her boyfriend Pablo said that morning, watching her while she tried various layering options under a blouse that had shrunk in the wash. "Why would you want to conform to some bullshit corporate dress code?" "Because my job requires it." "My poor corporate baby," he said, lost in the machine. Pablo talks about metaphorical machines a lot, also the man. He sometimes combines the two, as in, that's how the man wants us, just trapped right there in the corporate machine. They met at school. Pablo graduated a year ahead of her, and at first his career seemed so brilliant that she stopped being a waitress at his invitation. He sold a painting for $10,000, and then a larger one for $21,000, and he was poised to become the next big thing. But then a show got canceled, and he sold nothing else in the year that followed. Absolutely nothing. So Miranda signed with the temp agency and found herself a short time later at her desk in a high tower outside Leon Provence' office door. "Hang in there, baby," he said that morning, watching her dress. "You know this is only temporary." "Sure," she said. He's been saying this ever since she registered with the temp agency. But what she hasn't told him is that she went from temporary to permanent at the end of her 6th week on the job. Leon likes her. He appreciates how calm she always is. He says how unflappable. He even introduces her as such on the rare occasion when he's in the office. "And this is my unflappable assistant, Miranda." This pleases her more than she likes to admit to herself. "I'm going to sell those new paintings," Pablo said. He was half naked in bed, lying like a starfish. After she got up, he always liked to see how much of the bed he could sleep on at once. "You know there's a payday coming, right?" "Definitely," Miranda said, giving up on the blouse and trying to find a t-shirt that might look halfway professional under her $20 blazer. "Almost no one from that last show sold anything," he said, talking mostly to himself now. "I know it's temporary, but this is her secret. She doesn't want it to end." What she can never tell Pablo, because he disdains all things corporate, is that she likes being at Neptune Logistics more than she likes being at home. Home is a small, dark apartment with an ever-growing population of dust bunnies, the hallway narrowed by Pablo's canvases propped up against walls, an easel blocking the lower half of the living room window. Her workplace at Neptune Logistics is all clean lines and recessed lighting. She works on her never-ending project for hours at a time. In art school, they talked about day jobs in tones of horror. She never would have imagined that her day job would be the calmest and least cluttered part of her life. She receives 5 emails from Thea this morning, forwarded flight and hotel confirmations for Leon's upcoming trip to Asia. Miranda spends some time on the Asian travel itinerary. Japan, then Singapore, then South Korea. She likes looking up maps and imagining traveling to these places herself. She has still never left Canada. With Pablo not working or selling any paintings, she's only making minimum interest payments on her student loans, and she can barely cover their rent. She inserts the Singapore to Seoul flight information into the itinerary, double-checks the other confirmation numbers, and realizes that she's run out of tasks for the day. It's 9:45 a.m. Miranda reads the news for a while, spends some time looking at a map of the Korean peninsula, realizes that she's been staring blankly at the screen and thinking of the world of her project, her graphic novel, her comic book series, her whatever it is that she's been working on since she graduated from art school. She retrieves her sketchbook from the hiding place under the files in her top desk drawer. There are several important characters in the Station 11 project, but the hero is Dr. 11, a brilliant physicist who bears a striking physical resemblance to Pablo, but is otherwise nothing like him. He's a person from the future who never whines. He is dashing and occasionally sarcastic. He doesn't drink too much. He is afraid of nothing, but has poor luck with women. He took his name from the space station where he lives. A hostile civilization from a nearby galaxy has taken control of Earth and enslaved Earth's population. But a few hundred rebels managed to steal a space station and escape. Dr. 11 and his colleagues slipped Station 11 through a wormhole and are hiding in the uncharted reaches of deep space. This is all 1,000 years in the future. Station 11 is the size of Earth's moon and was designed to resemble a planet, but it's a planet that can chart a course through galaxies and requires no sun. The station's artificial sky was damaged in the war, however, so on Station 11's surface it is always sunset or twilight or night. There was also damage to a number of vital systems involving Station 11's ocean levels, and the only land remaining is a series of islands that were once mountaintops. There has been a schism. There are people who, after 15 years of perpetual twilight, long only to go home, to return to Earth and beg for amnesty, to take their chances under alien rule. They live in the undersea, an interlinked network of vast fallout shelters under Station 11's oceans. There are 300 of them now. In the scene Miranda's presently sketching, Dr. 11 is on a boat with his mentor, Captain Longigan. Dr. 11, these are perilous waters. We're passing over an undersea gate. Captain Longigan, you should try to understand them. The next panel is a close-up of his face. All they want is to see sunlight again. Can you blame them? After these two panels, she decides, she needs a full-page spread. She's already painted the image, and when she closes her eyes, she can almost see it, clipped to her easel at home. The seahorse is a massive, rust-colored creature with blank eyes like saucers. Half animal, half machine, the blue light of a radio transmitter glowing on the side of its head. Moving silent through the water, beautiful and nightmarish, a human rider from the undersea astride the curve of its spine. Deep blue water up to the top inch of the painting. On the water's surface, Dr. 11 and Captain Longigan in their rowboat, small under the foreign constellations of deep space. On the day she sees Arthur again, Pablo calls her on the office line in the afternoon. She's a few sips into her 4 p.m. coffee, sketching out a series of panels involving Dr. 11's efforts to thwart the Undersea's latest plot to sabotage the station reactors and force a return to Earth. She knows as soon as she hears Pablo's voice that it's going to be a bad call. He wants to know what time she'll be home. Sometime around 8. What I don't understand, Pablo says, is what you're doing for these people. She winds the phone cord around her finger and looks at the scene she was just working on. Dr. 11 is confronted by his undersea nemesis on a subterranean walkway by Station 11's main reactor, a thought bubble. But what insanity is this? Well, I put together Leon's travel itineraries. There have been a number of bad calls lately, and she's been trying to view them as opportunities to practice being patient. I handle his expense reports and send emails for him sometimes. There's the occasional message, I do the filing, and that takes up your entire day. Not at all. We've talked about this, Pickle. There's a lot of downtime, actually. And what do you do in that downtime, Miranda? I work on my project, Pablo. I'm not sure why your tone is so nasty. But the trouble is, she doesn't really care. There was a time when this conversation would have reduced her to tears, but now she swivels in her chair to look out at the lake and thinks about moving trucks. She could call in sick to work, pack up her things, and be gone in a few hours. It is sometimes necessary to break everything. 12-hour days, he's saying. You're never here, you're gone from 8 a.m. till 9 at night, and then you even go in on Saturdays sometimes. And I'm supposed to just, I don't know, Miranda. What would you say if you were me? Wait, she says. I just realized why you called me on the office line. What? You're verifying that I'm here, aren't you? That's why you didn't call me on my cell. A shiver of anger unexpectedly deep. She is paying the entire rent on their apartment, and he's verifying that she's actually at her job. The hours you work. He lets this hang in the air till it takes on the weight of accusation. Well, she says, one thing she's very good at is forcing her voice to remain calm when she's angry. As I've mentioned before, Leon was very clear when he hired me. He wants me at my desk until 7 p.m. when he's traveling, and if he's here, I'm here. He texts me when he comes in on weekends, and then I have to be here too. Oh, he texts you. The problem is that she's colossally bored with the conversation and also bored with Pablo and with the kitchen on Jarvis Street where she knows he's standing because he only makes angry phone calls from home. One of the things they have in common is a mutual distaste for sidewalk weepers and cell phone screamers, for people who conduct their messier personal affairs in public, and the kitchen gets the best reception of anywhere in the apartment. Pablo, it's just a job. We need the money. It's always money with you, isn't it? That is what's paying our rent. You know that, right? Are you saying I'm not pulling my weight, Miranda? Is that what you're saying? It isn't possible to continue to listen to this. So she sets the receiver gently on the cradle and finds herself wondering why she didn't notice earlier, say 8 years ago, when they first started dating, that Pablo is mean. His email arrives within minutes. The subject header is WTF, Miranda. It reads, "What's going on here? It seems like you're being weirdly hostile and kind of passive-aggressive. What gives?" She closes it without responding and stands by the glass wall for a while to look out at the lake. Imagining the water rising until it covers the streets, gondolas moving between the towers of the financial district, Dr. 11 on a high-arched bridge. She's standing here when her cell phone rings. She doesn't recognize the number. "It's Arthur Leander," he says when she answers. "Can I buy you another lunch?" "How about dinner instead?" "Tonight? Are you busy?" "No," he says, sitting on his bed in the Hotel Le Germain, wondering how he'll get out of dinner with the director this evening. "Not at all. It would be my pleasure." She decides it isn't necessary to call Pablo under the circumstances. There's a small task for Leon, who is about to board a plane to Lisbon. She finds a file he needs and emails it to him, and then returns to Station 11. Panels set in the undersea, people working quietly in cavernous rooms. They live out their lives under flickering lights, aware at all times of the fathoms of ocean above them, resentful of Dr. 11 and his colleagues who keep Station 11 moving forever through deep space. Pablo texts her, "Did you get my email?" They are always waiting, the people of the undersea. They spend all their lives waiting for their lives to begin. Miranda is drawing Leon Prevent's reception area before she realizes what she's doing. The prairies of carpet, the desk, Leon's closed office door, the wall of glass, the 2 staplers on her desk. How did she end up with 2? And the doors leading out to the elevators and restrooms. Trying to convey the serenity of this place where she spends most her pleasant hours, the refinement of it. But outside the glass wall, she substitutes another landscape, dark rocks and high bridges. "You're always half on Station 11, Pablo said during a fight a week or so ago, "and I don't even understand your project. What are you actually going for here?" He has no interest in comics. He doesn't understand the difference between serious graphic novels and Saturday morning cartoons with wide-eyed Tweety birds and floppy-limbed cats. When sober, he suggests that she's squandering her talent. When drunk, he implies there isn't much there to squander, although later he apologizes for this and sometimes cries. It's been a year and 2 months since he sold his last painting. She started to explain her project to him again, but the words stopped in her throat. "You don't have to understand it," she said. "It's mine." The restaurant where she meets Arthur is all dark wood and soft lighting, the ceiling a series of archways and domes. "I can use this," she thinks, waiting at the table for him to arrive. Imagining a room like this in the undersea, a subterranean place made of wood salvaged from the station's drowned forests, wishing she had her sketchbook with her. At 8:01 p.m., a text from Pablo. "I'm waiting." She turns off her phone and drops it in her handbag. Arthur comes in breathless and apologetic, 10 minutes late. His cab got stuck in traffic. I'm working on a comic book project, she tells him later when he asks about her work. Maybe a series of graphic novels. I don't know what it is yet. What made you choose that form? He seems genuinely interested. I used to read a lot of comics when I was a kid. Did you ever read Calvin and Hobbes? Arthur is watching her closely. He looks young, she thinks, for 36. He looks only slightly older than he did when they met for lunch 7 years ago. Sure, Arthur says. I loved Calvin and Hobbes. My best friend had a stack of the books when we were growing up. Is your friend from the island? Maybe I knew him. Her, Victoria. She picked up and moved to Toronto 15 years ago. But you were telling me about Calvin and Hobbes? Yes, right. Do you remember Spaceman Spiff? She loved those panels, especially. Piff's flying saucer crossing alien skies, the little astronaut in his goggles under the saucer's glass dome. Often it was funny, but also it was beautiful. She tells him about coming back to Delano Island for Christmas in her first year of art school, after a semester marked by failure and frustrating attempts at photography. She started thumbing through an old Calvin and Hobbes and thought, these red desert landscapes, these skies with 2 moons. She began thinking about the possibilities of the form, about spaceships and stars, alien planets, but a year passed before she invented the beautiful wreckage of Station 11. Arthur watches her across the table. Dinner goes very late. Are you still with Pablo? He asks, when they're out on the street. He's hailing a cab. Certain things have been decided without either of them exactly talking about it. We're breaking up. We're not right for each other. Saying it aloud makes it true. They are getting into a taxi. They're kissing in the back seat. He's steering her across the lobby of the hotel with his hand on her back. She is kissing him in the elevator. She is following him into a room. Text from Pablo at 9, 10, and 11 p.m. Are you mad at me? ? She replies to this. Staying with a friend tonight. We'll be home in the morning, and then we can talk. Which elicits, you know what? Don't bother coming home. And she feels a peculiar giddiness when she reads this 4th text. There are thoughts of freedom and imminent escape. I could throw away almost everything, she thinks, and begin all over again. Station 11 will be my constant. At 6 in the morning, she takes a taxi home to Jarvis Street. I want to see you tonight, Arthur whispers when she kisses him. They have plans to meet in his room after work. The apartment is dark and silent. There are dishes piled in the sink, a frying pan in the stove with bits of food stuck to it. The bedroom door is closed. She packs 2 suitcases, one for clothes, one for art supplies, and is gone in 15 minutes. In the employee gym at Neptune Logistics, she showers and changes into clothes slightly rumpled by the suitcase, meets her own gaze in the mirror while she's putting on makeup. I repent nothing. A line remembered from the fog of the internet. I am heartless, she thinks, but she knows even through her guilt that this isn't true. She knows there are traps everywhere that can make her cry. She knows the way she dies a little every time someone asks her for change and she doesn't give it to them means that she's too soft for this world, or perhaps just for this city. She feels so small here. There are tears in her eyes now. Miranda is a person with very few certainties, but one of them is that only the dishonorable leave when things get difficult. I don't know, Arthur says at 2 in the morning. They are lying in his enormous bed at the Hotel Le Germain. He's here in Toronto for 3 more weeks and then going back to Los Angeles. She wants to believe they're lying in moonlight, but she knows the light through the window is probably mostly electric. Can you call the pursuit of happiness dishonorable? Surely sleeping with film stars when you live with someone else isn't honorable per se. He shifts slightly in the bed, uncomfortable with the term film star, and kisses the top of her head. I'm going to go back to the apartment in the morning to get a few more things, she says sometime around 4 a.m., half asleep. Thinking about a painting she left on her easel, a seahorse rising up from the bottom of the ocean. They've been talking about plans. Things have been solidifying rapidly. You don't think he'll do anything stupid, do you, Pablo? No, she says. He won't do anything except maybe yell. She can't keep her eyes open. You sure about that? He waits for an answer, but she's fallen asleep. He kisses her forehead. She murmurs something but doesn't wake up. and lifts the duvet to cover her bare shoulders, turns off the television, and then the light. Chapter 15. Later, they have a house in the Hollywood Hills and a Pomeranian who shines like a little ghost when Miranda calls for her at night, a white smudge in the darkness at the end of the yard. There are photographers who follow Arthur and Miranda in the street, who keep Miranda forever anxious and on edge. Arthur's name appears above the titles of his movies now. On the night of their 3rd anniversary, his face is on billboards all over the continent. Tonight they're having a dinner party, and Luli, their Pomeranian, is watching the proceedings from the sunroom, where she's been exiled for begging table scraps. Every time Miranda glances up from the table, she sees Luli peering in through the glass French doors. "Your dog looks like a marshmallow," says Gary Heller, who is Arthur's lawyer. "She's the cutest little thing," Elizabeth Colton says. Her face is next to Arthur's on the billboards, flashing a brilliant smile with very red lips. But off-screen, she wears no lipstick and seems nervous and shy. She is beautiful in a way that makes people forget what they were going to say when they look at her. She's very soft-spoken. People are forever leaning in close to hear what she's saying. There are 10 guests here tonight, an intimate evening to celebrate both the anniversary and the opening weekend figures. 2 birds with 1 stone, Arthur said, but there's something wrong with the evening, and Miranda is finding it increasingly difficult to hide her unease. Why would a 3-year wedding anniversary celebration involve anyone other than the 2 people who are actually married to one another? Who are all these extraneous people at my table? She's seated at the opposite end of the table from Arthur, and she somehow can't quite manage to catch his eye. He's talking to everyone except her. No one seems to have noticed that Miranda is saying very little. "I wish you'd try a little harder," Arthur has said to her once or twice. But she knows she'll never belong here no matter how hard she tries. These are not her people. She is marooned on a strange planet. The best she can do is pretend to be unflappable when she isn't. Plates and bottles are being ferried to and from the table by a small army of caterers who will leave their headshots and possibly a screenplay or 2 behind in the kitchen at the end of the night. Luli, on the wrong side of the glass, is staring at a strawberry that's fallen off the top of Heller's wife's dessert. Miranda has a poor memory when she's nervous, which is to say whenever she has to meet industry people or throw a dinner party, or especially both, and she absolutely cannot remember Heller's wife's name, although she's heard it at least twice this evening. "Oh, it was intense," Heller's wife is saying now in response to something that Miranda didn't hear. "We were out there for a week, just surfing every day. It was actually really spiritual." "The surfing?" the producer seated beside her asks. "You wouldn't think it, right? But just going out every day, just you and the waves and the private instructor, it was just a really focused experience. Do you surf?" "I'd love to, but I've just been so busy with this whole school thing lately," the producer says. "Actually, I guess you'd maybe call it an orphanage. It's this little thing I set up in Haiti last year, but the point is education, not just housing these kids." "I don't know. I'm not attached to his project or anything." Arthur is deep in conversation with an actor who played his brother in a film last year. "I've never met the guy, but I've heard through friends that he likes my work." "I've met him a few times," the actor says. Miranda tunes out the overlapping conversations to look at Luli, who's looking at her through the glass. She'd like to take Luli outside and stay in the backyard with her until all these people leave. The dessert plates are cleared around midnight, but no one's close to leaving. A wine-drenched languor settling over the table. Arthur is deep in conversation with Heller. Heller's nameless wife is gazing dreamily at the chandelier. Clark Thompson is here, Arthur's oldest friend, and the only person at this table, aside from Miranda, who has no professional involvement in the movies. "I'm sorry," a woman named Tesh is saying now to Clark. "What exactly is it that you do?" Tesh seems to be someone who mistakes rudeness for intellectual rigor. She is about 40 and wears severe black-framed glasses that somehow remind Miranda of architects. Miranda met her for the first time this evening, and she can't remember what Tesh does, except that obviously she's involved in some way with the industry. A film editor, maybe? And also Miranda doesn't understand Tesh's name. Is she Tesh something or something Tesh? Or a one-namer like Madonna? Are you allowed to have only one name if you're not famous? Is it possible that Tesh is actually extremely famous and Miranda is the only one at the table who doesn't know this? Yes, that seems very possible. These are the things she frets about. What do I do? Nothing terribly glamorous, I'm afraid. Clark is British, thin and very tall, elegant in his usual uniform of vintage suit and Converse sneakers, accessorized with pink socks. He brought them a gift tonight, a beautiful glass paperweight from a museum gift shop in Rome. I have nothing to do with the film industry, he says. Oh, Heller's wife says. I think that's marvelous. It's certainly exotic, Tesh says, but that doesn't narrow down the field much, does it? Doesn't narrow the field much, does it? Management counseling, based out of New York. New client in Los Angeles. I specialize in the repair and maintenance of faulty executives. Clark sips his wine. And what's that in English? The premise of the company by which I'm employed, Clark says, is that if one's employer of an executive who's worthy in some ways but deeply flawed in others, it's sometimes cheaper to fix the executive than to replace him or her. He's an organizational psychologist, Arthur says, surfacing from conversation at the far end of the table. I remember when he went back to England to get his PhD. A PhD, Tesh says. How conventional. And you? She's turned to Miranda. How's your work going? It's going very well, thank you. Miranda spends most of her time working on the Station 11 project. She knows from the gossip blogs that people here see her as an eccentric, the actor's wife who inks mysterious cartoons that no one's ever laid eyes on. My wife's very private about her work, Arthur says in interviews, and who doesn't drive and likes to go for long walks in town where nobody walks anywhere, and who has no friends except a Pomeranian, although does anyone really know this last part? She hopes not. Her friendlessness is never mentioned in gossip blogs, which she appreciates. She hopes she isn't as awkward to other people as she feels to herself. Elizabeth Colton is looking at her again in that golden way of hers. Elizabeth's hair is always unbrushed and always looks gorgeous that way. Her eyes are very blue. It's brilliant, Arthur says. I mean that. Someday she'll show it to the world and we'll all say we knew her when. When will it be finished? Soon, Miranda says. It's true. It won't be long now. She has felt for months that she's nearing the end of something, even though the story has spun off in a dozen directions and feels most days like a mess of hanging threads. She tries to meet Arthur's gaze, but he's looking at Elizabeth. What do you plan to do with it once you're done? Tesh asks. I don't know. Surely you'll try to publish it. Miranda has complicated feelings on the topic, Arthur says. Is it Miranda's imagination, or is he going out of his way to avoid looking at her directly? Oh? Tesh smiles and arches an eyebrow. It's the work itself that's important to me. Miranda is aware of how pretentious this sounds, but is it still pretentious if it's true? Not whether I publish it or not. I think that's so great, Elizabeth says. It's like the point is that it exists in the world, right? What's the point of doing all that work, Tesh says, if no one sees it? It makes me happy. It's peaceful, spending hours working on it. It doesn't really matter to me if anyone else sees it. Ah, Tesh says. Very admirable of you. You know, it reminds me of a documentary I saw last month, a little Czech film about an outsider artist who refused to show her work during her lifetime. She lived in Praha and... Oh, Clark says, I believe when you're speaking English, you're allowed to refer to it as Prague. Tesh appears to have lost the power of speech. It's a beautiful city, isn't it? Elizabeth has the kind of smile that makes everyone around her smile too, unconsciously. Ah, you've been there? Clark asks. I took a couple of art history classes at UCLA a few years back. I went to Prague at the end of the semester to see a few of the paintings I'd read about. There's such a weight of history in that place, isn't there? I wanted to move there. For the history? I grew up in the exurbs of Indianapolis, Elizabeth says. I live in a neighborhood where the oldest building is 50 or 60 years old. There's something appealing about the thought of living in a place with some history to it, don't you think? So tonight, Heller says, if I'm not mistaken, is tonight the actual wedding anniversary? It certainly is, Arthur says, and glasses are raised. 3 years. He's smiling past Miranda's left ear. She glances over her shoulder, and when she looks back, he's shifted his gaze somewhere else. How did you two meet? Heller's wife asks. The thing about Hollywood, Miranda realized early on, is that almost everyone is Thea, her former colleague at Neptune Logistics, which is to say that almost everyone has the right clothes, the right haircut, the right everything, while Miranda flails after them in the wrong outfit with her hair sticking up. Oh, it's not the most exciting how we met story in the world, I'm afraid. A slim strain in Arthur's voice. I think how we met stories are always exciting, Elizabeth says. You're much more patient than I am, Clark says. I don't know if exciting is the word I'd use, Heller's wife says, but there's certainly a sweetness about them. About those stories, I mean. No, it's just if everything happens for a reason, Elizabeth persists, as personally I believe that it does, then when I hear a story of how two people came together, it's like a piece of the plan is being revealed. In the silence that follows this pronouncement, a caterer refills Miranda's wine. We're from the same island, Miranda says. Oh, that island you told us about, a woman from the studio says to Arthur. With the ferns. So you're from the island? And? Heller now looking at Arthur. Not everyone is listening. There are pools and eddies of conversation around the table. Heller's tan is orange. There are rumors that he doesn't sleep at night. On the other side of the glass doors, Luli shifts position to gain a better view of the dropped strawberry. Excuse me a moment, Miranda says. I'm just going to let the dog out. Arthur tells this story much better than I do. She escapes into the sunroom, through a set of French doors into the back lawn. Freedom. Outside, the quiet night. Luli brushes against her ankles and fades out into the darkness. The backyard isn't large. Their property terraced up the side of a hill, leaves crowding in around a small launch pad of lawn. The gardener came today in preparation for the dinner party, and the air carries notes of damp soil and freshly cut grass. She turns back toward the dining room, knowing that they can't see her past their own overlapping reflections of the glass. She left both sets of doors open just slightly in order to hear the conversation, and now Arthur's voice carries into the yard. So, dinner goes well, and then the next night, he says, I'm in the Hotel Le Germain after 12 hours on set in my room, waiting for Miranda to come by so I can take her out to dinner again. Second night in a row, just kind of semi-comatose in front of the television. There's a knock at the door, and voila, there she is again, but this time, one small difference. He pauses for effect. She can see Luli again now, following a mysterious scent at the far end of the lawn. This time, I'll be damned if the girl hasn't got her worldly belongings with her. Laughter. The story's funny, the way he tells it. She shows up on his hotel room doorstep with 2 suitcases, having walked across the lobby with such confidence that anyone would think that she was a guest there. The best advice her mother ever gave her, walk in like you own the place. She says something vague to Arthur about how she's moving into a hotel herself, and perhaps he wouldn't mind if she just leaves the suitcases here while they go to dinner. But he's already in love, and he kisses her, and he takes her to bed, and they don't leave the hotel at all that night. He invites her to stay a few nights, and she never moves out, and now here we are in Los Angeles. He doesn't tell the whole story. He doesn't tell the crowd assembled at the table that when she went back to the apartment the next morning for a painting she decided she wanted, a watercolor left behind on a drafting table, Pablo was awake and waiting for her, drunk and weeping, and she returned to the hotel with a bruise on her face. Arthur doesn't tell them that he took her with him to the set that morning and passed her off as his cousin, that she called in sick to work and spent the day in his trailer reading magazines and trying not to think about Pablo while Arthur came and went in his costume, which involved a long red velvet cape and a crown. He looked magnificent. Every time he looked at her that day, something clenched in her chest. When he was done with work in the evening, he had a driver drop them at a restaurant downtown, where he sat across the table from her, looking very ordinary in a Toronto Blue Jays cap, and she looked at him that night and thought, I prefer you with a crown. But of course, she would never say this aloud. 3.5 years later, in the Hollywood Hills, she stands outside in the yard and wonders if anyone at the table saw the tabloid photo that appeared the following morning, shot as they were leaving the restaurant. Arthur with his arm around her shoulders, Miranda in dark glasses, and Arthur blinded by the flash, which washed her out so mercifully that in the photo version of that moment, the bruise was erased. "What a lovely story," someone says, and Arthur agrees. Arthur is pouring wine. He's raising his glass, and he's toasting her. "Here's to my beautiful, brilliant wife." But Miranda, watching from outside, sees everything. The way Elizabeth goes still and looks down. The way Arthur thanks everyone for coming to his home, meeting everyone's eyes except Elizabeth's, who has lightly touched his thigh under the table. And this is when she understands. It's too late, and it's been too late for a while. She draws an uneven breath. "Great story," Heller says. "Where is that wife of yours?" Could she possibly go around to the front of the house, sneak in the front door and up to her studio unannounced, then text Arthur to say that she has a headache? She steps away from the glass, toward the center of the lawn where the shadows are deepest. From here, the dinner party looks like a diorama, white walls and golden light and glamorous people. She turns her back on it to look for Luli. The dog is nosing around in the grass, delighted by a scent at the base of an azalea bush. And this is when she hears the glass doors close behind her. Clark has come out for a cigarette. Her plan was to pretend, if anyone came out here, that she's looking for the dog, but he doesn't ask. He taps the cigarette box on the palm of his hand and holds out a cigarette without speaking. She crosses the grass and takes it from him, leans in when he flicks the lighter, and observes the dinner party while she inhales. Arthur is laughing. His hand strays to Elizabeth's wrist and rests there for an instant before he refills her wine. Why is Elizabeth sitting next to him? How could they be so indiscreet? Not a pretty sight, is it? She thinks of disagreeing, but something in Clark's voice stops her. Does everyone already know? What do you mean? She asks, but her voice is shaky. He glances at her and turns his back on the tableau, and after a moment she does the same. There's nothing to be gained by watching the shipwreck. "I'm sorry for being rude to your guest in there." "Tesh, please, don't be polite to her on my account. She's the most pretentious woman I've ever met in my life." "I've met worse." She hasn't smoked in a while, managed to convince herself that smoking is disgusting, but it's a pleasure, actually, more of a pleasure than she remembered. The lit end flares in the darkness when she inhales. She likes Hollywood best at night, in the quiet, when it's all dark leaves and shadows and night-blooming flowers, the edges softened, gently lit streets curving up into the hills. Luli wanders near them, snuffling in the grass. There are stars tonight, a few, although most are blanked out by the haze of the city. "Good luck, darling," Clark says quietly. He finished his cigarette. When she turns, he's already re-entering the party, reclaiming his place at the table. "Oh, she's just searching for the dog," she hears him say in response to a question. "I expect she'll be in any moment now." Dr. 11 has a Pomeranian. She hadn't realized this before, but it makes perfect sense. He has few friends, and without a dog, he'd be too lonely. That night, in her study, she sketches a scene. Dr. 11 stands on an outcropping of rock, a thin silhouette with a fedora pulled low, scanning the choppy sea, and a small white dog stands windswept beside him. She doesn't realize, until halfway through drawing the dog, that she's given Dr. 11 a clone of Luli. Wind turbines spin on the horizon. Dr. 11's Luli gazes at the sea. Miranda's Luli sleeps on a pillow at her feet, twitching in a dog dream. Miranda's study window looks out over the side yard, where the lawn terraces down to the pool. Beside the pool stands a lamp from the 1950s, a crescent moon atop a tall, dark pole, placed in such a way that there's always a moon reflected in the water. The lamp is her favorite thing about this house, although she wonders sometimes about the reason for its existence. A diva who insisted on permanent moonlight? A bachelor who hoped to impress young starlets? There's a brief period most nights when the two moons float side by side on the surface. The fake moon, which has the advantage of being closer and not obscured by smog, is almost always brighter than the real one. At 3 a.m, Miranda leaves her drafting table and goes down to the kitchen for a second cup of tea. All of the guests except one have departed. At the end of the night, everyone was drunk, but climbed into expensive cars anyway, all except Elizabeth Colton, who drank quietly, determinedly, without taking any apparent pleasure in it, until she passed out on a sofa in the living room. Clark plucked the wineglass from her hand. Arthur removed Elizabeth's car keys from her handbag and dropped them into an opaque vase on the mantelpiece. Miranda covered her with a blanket, and left a glass of water nearby. "I think we should talk," Miranda said to Arthur when the last guest, except Elizabeth, was gone, but he waved her off and stumbled in the direction of the bedroom, said something about talking in the morning on his way up the stairs. The house is silent now, and she feels like a stranger here. "This life was never ours," she whispers to the dog, who has been following her from room to room, and Lily wags her tail and stares at Miranda with wet brown eyes. "We were only ever borrowing it." In the living room, Elizabeth Colton is still unconscious. Even passed out drunk, she's a vision in the lamplight. In the kitchen, 4 headshots are lying on the countertop. Miranda studies these while the water's boiling and recognizes somewhat younger and more brooding versions of 4 of the night's caterers. She puts on a pair of flip-flops in the sunroom and lets herself out into the cool night air. She sits for a while at the poolside with her tea, Luli beside her, and splashes her feet in the water to watch the moon reflection ripple and break. There's a sound from the street, a car door closing. "Stay," she tells Luli, who sits by the pool and watches as Miranda opens the gate in the front driveway where Elizabeth's convertible is parked dark and gleaming. Miranda runs her fingertips along the side of the car as she passes, and they come away coated with a fine layer of dust. The streetlight at the end of the driveway is a frenzy of moths. 2 cars are parked on the street. A man leans on one of them, smoking a cigarette. In the other car, a man is asleep in the driver's seat. She recognizes both men because they follow her and Arthur much more frequently than anyone else does. "Hey," the man with the cigarette says, and reaches for his camera. He's about her age, with sideburns and dark hair that falls in his eyes. "Don't," she says sharply, and he hesitates. "What are you doing out so late?" "Are you going to take my picture?" He lowers the camera. "Thank you," she says. "In answer to your question, I just came out here to see if you might have an extra cigarette." "How'd you know I'd have one?" "Because you're in front of my house smoking every night." Six nights a week," he says. "I take Mondays off." "What's your name?" "Jeevan Chaudhry." "So do you have a cigarette for me, Jeevan?" "Sure. Here. I didn't know you smoked." "I just started again." "Light?" "So," he says, once her cigarette's lit, "this is a first." She ignores this, looking up at the house. "It's pretty from here, isn't it?" "Yes," he says. "You have a beautiful home." Was that sarcasm? She isn't sure. She doesn't care. She's always found the house beautiful, but it's even more so now that she knows she's leaving. It's modest by the standards of people whose names appear above the titles of their movies, but extravagant beyond anything she would have imagined for herself. In all my life, there will never be another house like this. "You know what time it is?" he asks. "I don't know, about 3 a.m., maybe more like 3:30. "Why is Elizabeth Colton's car still in the driveway?" "Because she's a raging alcoholic," Miranda says. His eyes widen. "Really?" "She's too wasted to drive." "You didn't hear that from me." "Sure, no, thank you." "You're welcome. You people live for that kind of gossip, don't you?" "No," he says. "I live on that kind of gossip, actually, as in it pays my rent. What I live for is something different." "What do you live for?" "Truth and beauty," he says, deadpan. "You like your job?" "I don't hate it." She is dangerously close to tears. "So you enjoy stalking people?" He laughs. "Let's just say the job fits with my basic understanding of what work is." "I don't understand." "Of course you don't. You don't have to work for a living." "Please," Miranda says. "I've worked all my life. I worked all through school. These past few years are an anomaly." Although as she says this, she can't help but think of Pablo. She lived off him for 10 months until it became clear that they were going to run out of money before he sold another painting. In the next version of her life, she decides, she will be entirely independent. Forget it. "No, really, I'm curious. What's your understanding of work?" "Work is combat." "So you've hated every job you've had, is that what you're saying?" Jeevan shrugs. He's looking at something on his phone, distracted, his face lit blue by the screen. Miranda returns her attention to the house, the sensation of being in a dream that will end any moment. Only she isn't sure if she's fighting to wake up or to stay asleep. Elizabeth's car is all long curves and streaks of reflected light. Miranda thinks of the places she might go now that Los Angeles is over. And what surprises her is that the first place that comes to mind is Neptune Logistics. She misses the order of the place, the utter manageability of her job there, the cool air of Leon Prevent's office suite, the calm of the lake. Hey, Jeevan says suddenly, and as Miranda turns, the cigarette halfway to her mouth, the flash of his camera catches her unaware. 5 or more flashes in quick succession as she drops the cigarette on the sidewalk and walks quickly away from him, enters a code into the keypad, and slips back into the side gate, the after image of the first flash floating across her vision. How could she have let her guard down? How could she have been so stupid? In the morning, her picture will appear in a gossip website. Trouble in Paradise? Amid rumors of Arthur's infidelity, Miranda wanders the streets of Hollywood at 4 a.m., crying and smoking. In the photograph, Miranda alone in the small hours of the morning with obvious tears in her eyes, pale in the flash, her hair standing up and a cigarette between her fingers, lips parted, a bra strap showing where her dress has slipped. But first, there is the rest of the night to get through. Miranda closes the gate and sits for a long time on a stone bench by the pool, shaking. Luli jumps up to sit beside her. Eventually, Miranda dries her eyes and they go back to the house, where Elizabeth is still sleeping, and upstairs where Miranda stops to listen outside of the bedroom door. Arthur snores. She opens the door to his study, which is the opposite of her study, which is to say the housekeeper is allowed to come in. Arthur's study is painfully neat. 4 stacks of scripts on the desk, which is made of glass and steel. An ergonomic chair, a tasteful lamp. Beside the lamp, a flat leather box with a drawer that pulls open with a ribbon. She opens this and finds what she's looking for, a yellow legal pad on which she's seen him write before. But tonight, there's only an unfinished fragment of Arthur's latest letter to his childhood friend. Dear V, strange days, the feeling that one's life resembles a movie, thinking a lot of the future. I have such. Nothing else. You have such what, Arthur? Did your phone ring mid-sentence? Yesterday's date at the top of the page. She puts the legal pad back exactly as she found it, uses the hem of her dress to wipe a fingertip smudge from the desk. Her gaze falls on the gift that Clark brought this evening, a paperweight of clouded glass. When she holds it, it's a pleasing weight in the palm of her hand. It's like looking into a storm. She tells herself as she switches off the light that she's only taking the paperweight back to her study to sketch it, but she knows she's going to keep it forever. When she returns to her study, it's nearly dawn. Dr. 11, the landscape, the dog, a text box for Dr. 11's interior monologue across the bottom. After Lonigan's death, all of life seemed awkward to me. I'd become a stranger to myself. She erases and rewrites. After Lonigan's death, I felt like a stranger. The sentiment seems right, but somehow not for this image. A new image to go before this one. A close-up of the note left on Captain Lonigan's body by an undersea assassin. We were not meant for this world. Let us go home. In the next image, Dr. 11 holds the note in his hand as he stands on the outcropping of rock, the little dog by his boots, his thoughts. The first sentence of the assassin's note rang true. We were not meant for this world. I returned to my city, to my shattered life and damaged home, to my loneliness, and tried to forget the sweetness of life on earth. Too long, also melodramatic. She erases it and writes in soft pencil, I stood looking over my damaged home and tried to forget the sweetness of life on earth. A sound behind her. Elizabeth Colton leans in the doorway, holding a glass of water with both hands. I'm sorry, she says. I didn't mean to disturb. I saw the light was on in here. Come in. Miranda is surprised to realize she's more curious than anything. A memory of the first night at the Hotel Les Germain in Toronto lying beside Arthur, the awareness of a beginning. And now, here's the ending, standing in her doorway, half drunk, legs like pipe cleaners in her skinny jeans, tousled and in disarray, smudges of mascara under her eyes, a sheen of sweat on her nose, but still beautiful, still one of the finest specimens of her kind in Los Angeles. Of Los Angeles in a way. In a way Miranda knows she never will be, no matter how long she stays here or how hard she tries. Elizabeth steps forward and sinks unexpectedly to the floor. By some small miracle, she's managed not to spill the water. "I'm sorry," she says. "I'm a little wobbly." "Aren't we all?" Miranda says. But as usually happens when she tries to say something funny, her audience seems not to catch the joke. Elizabeth and the dog are both staring at her. "Please don't cry," she says to Elizabeth, whose eyes are shining. "Don't, really. I'm serious. It's too much." "I'm sorry," Elizabeth says for the third time. That infuriatingly small voice. She sounds like a different person when she's in front of a camera. "Stop apologizing." Elizabeth blinks. "You're working on your secret project." She is looking all around the room. She falls silent, and after a moment Miranda succumbs to curiosity and sits on the floor beside Elizabeth to see the room from her vantage point. Paintings and sketches are pinned to the walls. Notes on structure and chronology cover a massive board. There are 4 pages of story outlines taped to the windowsill. "What happens next?" Miranda asks. It's easier to talk to Elizabeth when they're sitting side by side, when she doesn't have to look at her. "I don't know." "You do know." "I wish I could tell you how sorry I am," Elizabeth says, "but you've already told me to stop apologizing." "It's just an awful thing to do." "I don't think I'm an awful person," Elizabeth says. "No one ever thinks they're awful, even people who really actually are. It's some sort of survival mechanism. I think this is happening because it was supposed to happen." Elizabeth speaks very softly. "I'd prefer not to think that I'm following a script," Miranda says, but she's tired. There's no sting in her voice. It's past 4 in the morning and too late in every sense. Elizabeth says nothing, just pulls her knees close to her chest and sighs. In 3 months, Miranda and Arthur will sit in a conference room with their lawyers to work out the final terms of their divorce settlement, while the paparazzi smoke cigarettes on the sidewalk outside, while Elizabeth packs to move into the house with the crescent moonlight by the pool. In 4 months, Miranda will be back in Toronto, divorced at 27, working on a commerce degree, spending her alimony on expensive clothing and consultations with stylists because she's come to understand that clothes are armor. She will call Leon Prevant and ask about employment, and a week later she'll be back at Neptune Logistics, in a more interesting job now, working under Leon in client relations, rising rapidly through the company until she comes to a point after 4 or 5 years when she travels almost constantly between a dozen countries and lives mostly out of a carry-on suitcase, a time when she lives a life that feels like freedom and sleeps with her downstairs neighbor occasionally but refuses to date anyone, whispers "I repent nothing" into the mirrors of 100 hotel rooms from London to Singapore, and in the morning puts on the clothes that make her invincible, a life where the moments of emptiness and disappointment are minimal, where by her mid-30s she feels competent and at last more or less at ease in the world, studying foreign languages in first-class lounges and traveling in comfortable seats across oceans, meeting with clients and living her job, breathing her job, until she isn't sure where she stops and her job begins, almost always loves her life but is often lonely, draws the stories of Station 11 and hotel rooms at night. But first, there's this moment, this lamp-lit room. Miranda sits on the floor beside Elizabeth, whose breath is heavy with wine, and she leans back until she feels the reassuring solidity of the doorframe against her spine. Elizabeth, who is crying a little, bites her lip, and together they look at the sketches and paintings pinned to every wall. The dog stands in attention and stares at the window, where just now a moth brushed up against a glass, and for a moment everything is still. Station 11 is all around them. Chapter 16. A transcript of an interview, conducted by Francois Diallo, librarian of the town of New Petoskey, publisher and editor of the New Petoskey News. 26 years after Miranda and Arthur's last dinner party in Los Angeles, and 15 years after the Georgia flu. Francis Diallo. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. Kirsten Ramon. My pleasure. What are you writing? Diallo. It's my own private shorthand. I made it up. Ramon. Is it faster? Diallo. Very much so. I can transcribe an interview in real time, and then write it out later. Now, I appreciate you talking to me this afternoon. As I mentioned yesterday, I've just started a newspaper, and I've been interviewing everyone who comes through New Petoskey. Ramon, I'm not sure I have much news to tell you. Diallo, if you were to talk about the other towns you've passed through, that would count as news to us. The world's become so local, hasn't it? We hear stories from traders, of course, but most people don't leave their towns anymore. I think my readers will be interested in hearing from people who've been to other places since the collapse. Ramon. Okay. Diallo. And more than that, well, publishing the newspaper has been an invigorating project. But then I thought, why stop with a newspaper? Why not create an oral history of this time we live in and an oral history of the collapse? With your permission, I'll publish excerpts from this interview in the next edition, and I'll keep the entirety of the interview for my archives. Ramon. That's fine. It's an interesting project. I know you're supposed to be interviewing me, but could I ask you a question first? Diallo. Of course. Ramon. You've been a librarian for a long time. Diallo. Since year 4. Ramon. Those comics I showed you just now, with the space station, have you ever seen them before, or others in the series? Diallo. Never. No, they're not part of any comic book series I've ever come across. You said someone gave them to you as a gift? Ramon. Arthur Leander gave them to me. That actor I told you about. Chapter 17. A year before the Georgia flu, Arthur and Clark met for dinner in London. Arthur was passing through town en route to Paris at a moment when Clark happened to be visiting his parents, and they agreed to meet for dinner in a corner of the city that Clark didn't know especially well. He'd set out early, but when he stepped out of the tube station, he had a vision of his phone lying where he'd left it on his parents' kitchen counter, a map application open on the screen. Clark liked to think he knew London, but the truth was he'd spent most of his adult life in New York, secure within the confines of Manhattan's idiot-proof grid. And on this particular evening, London's tangle of streets was inscrutable. The side street for which he was searching failed to materialize, and he found himself wandering, increasingly late, angry and embarrassed, retracing his footsteps and trying different turns. He hailed a cab when the rain began. "Easiest £2 I ever made in me life," the cabbie said, when Clark told him the address. The cabbie performed 2 left turns in rapid succession, and they were at the restaurant on a side street that Clark could have sworn hadn't been there when he'd passed by 10 minutes ago. "Of course," the cabbie said, "you don't know where you're going unless you know where you're going." And when Clark went in, Arthur was waiting, caught under a beam of track lighting in a booth at the back. There had been a time when Arthur would never have faced the dining room of a restaurant, long periods when the only way to eat a meal in peace was to sit with his back to the room and hope no one would recognize his hunched shoulders and expensive haircut from behind. But now, Clark realized, Arthur wanted to be seen. "Dr. Thompson," Arthur said. "Mr. Leander." The disorientation of meeting one's sagging contemporaries, memories of a younger face crashing into the reality of jowls, under-eye pouches, unexpected lines, and then the terrible realization that one probably looks just as old as they do. "Do you remember when we were young and gorgeous?" Clark wanted to ask. "Do you remember when everything seemed limitless? Do you remember when it seemed impossible that you'd get famous and I'd get a PhD? But instead of saying any of this, he wished his friend a happy birthday. You remembered." "Of course," Clark said. "That's one thing I like about birthdays. They stay in one place. Same spot on the calendar, year in, year out." "But the years keep going faster. Have you noticed?" They settled into the business of ordering drinks and appetizers, and all Clark could think of as they talked was whether or not Arthur had noticed that a couple at a nearby table was looking at him and whispering. If Arthur had noticed, he seemed supremely unconcerned, but the attention put Clark on edge. "You going to Paris tomorrow?" Clark asked, somewhere between the first martini and the appetizers. "Visiting my son. Elizabeth's vacationing there with him this week." "It's just been a bitch of a year, Clark." "I know," Clark said. "I'm sorry." Arthur's third wife had recently served him with divorce papers, and her predecessor had taken their son to Jerusalem. "Why Israel?" Arthur said miserably. "That's the part I don't understand. Of all places." Wasn't she a history major in college? Maybe that's what she likes about it, all the history in the place. I think I'll have the duck, Arthur said, and this was the last they spoke of Elizabeth. Actually, the last they spoke of anything of substance. I've been indecently lucky, Arthur said later that night on his fourth martini. It was a line he'd been using a great deal lately. Clark wouldn't have been bothered by it if he hadn't read Arthur use it in Entertainment Weekly a month or two earlier. The restaurant was one of those large, underlit places that seemed to recede into shadow at the periphery, and in the murky middle distance, Clark saw a pinpoint of green light that meant someone was recording Arthur on a cell phone. Clark felt increasingly stiff. He was aware of the whispers that had sprung up, the glances from other tables. Arthur was talking about an endorsement deal of some kind, men's watches, his gestures loose. He was telling an animated story about his meeting with the watch executives, some kind of humorous misunderstanding in the boardroom. He was performing. Clark had thought he was meeting his oldest friend for dinner, but Arthur wasn't having dinner with a friend, Clark realized, so much as having dinner with an audience. He felt sick with disgust. When he left a short time later, he found himself wandering, even though by now he'd oriented himself and knew how to get back to the tube station. Cold rain, the sidewalk shining, the shh of a car tires on the wet street, thinking about the terrible gulf of years between 18 and 50. Chapter 18. Diallo. I'll ask you more about Arthur Leander in the comics in a moment. Perhaps I could ask you a few questions about your life first. Ramon. You know me, Francois. We've been coming through this town for years. Diallo. Yes, of course. But some of our readers might not know you, or the symphony. I've been giving copies of the paper to traders, asking them to distribute it along their routes. You've been acting since you were very young, isn't that right? Ramon. Very young. I was in a commercial when I was 3. Do you remember commercials? Diallo. I do, regrettably. What were you selling? Ramon. I don't actually remember the thing itself, the commercial, but I remember my brother telling me it was for arrowroot biscuits. Diallo. I remember those too. What came after the biscuits? Ramon. I don't actually remember, but my brother told me a little. He said I did more commercials, and when I was 6 or 7, I had a reoccurring role on a televised show. Diallo. Do you remember which show? Ramon. I wish I did. I can't remember anything about it. I think I've mentioned before, I have some problems with memory. I can't remember very much from before the collapse. Diallo. It's not uncommon among people who were children when it happened. And the symphony? You've been with them for a while, haven't you? Ramon. Since I was 14. Diallo. Where did they find you? Ramon. Ohio. The town where we ended up after we left Toronto, my brother and I. And then after he died, I was there by myself. Diallo. I didn't know they went that far south. Ramon. They only went down there once. It was a failed experiment. They wanted to expand the territory, so that spring they followed the Maumee River down past the ruins of Toledo, and then the Auglaize River into Ohio, and they eventually walked into the town where I lived. Diallo. Why do you say it was a failed experiment? Ramon. I'll always be grateful that they passed through my town, but the expedition was a disaster for them. By the time they reached Ohio, they'd lost an actor to some illness on the road, something that looked like malaria, and they got shot at 3 times in various places. One of the flautists got hit and almost died in a gunshot wound. We, the symphony, never left their usual territory again. Diallo. It seems like a very dangerous life. Ramon. No, that was years ago. It's much less dangerous than it used to be. Diallo. The other towns you passed through, are they different from here? Ramon. The places we return to more than once aren't dissimilar to here. Some places you pass through once and never return, because you can tell something's very wrong. Everyone's afraid, or it seems like some people have enough to eat and other people are starving, or you see pregnant 11-year-olds and you know the place is either lawless or in the grip of something, a cult of some kind. There are towns that are perfectly reasonable, logical systems of governance and such, and then you pass through 2 years later and they've slid into disarray. All towns have their own traditions. There are towns like this one, where you're interested in the past. You've got a library. Diallo. The more we know about the former world, the better we'll understand what happened when it fell. Ramon. But everyone knows what happened. The new strain of swine flu, and then the flights out of Moscow, those planes full of patient zeros. Diallo. Nonetheless, I believe in understanding history. Ramon. Fair enough. Some towns, as I was saying, some towns are like this one, where they want to talk about what happened, about the past. Other towns, discussion of the past is discouraged. We went to a place once where the children didn't know the world had ever been different, although you'd think all the rusted out automobiles and telephone wires would give them a clue. Some towns are easier to visit than others. Some places have elected mayors, or they're run by elected committees. Sometimes a cult takes over, and those towns are the most dangerous. Diallo. In what sense? Ramon. In the sense that they're unpredictable. You can't argue with them, because they live by an entirely different logic. You come to a town where everyone's dressed in all white, for example. I'm thinking of a town we visited once just outside our usual territory, north of Kincardine. And then they tell you that they were saved from the Georgia flu and survived the collapse because they're superior people and free from sin. And what can you say to that? It isn't logical. You can't argue with it. You just remember your own lost family, and either you want to cry or harbor murderous thoughts.